The knock came at a moment when Emma believed her day was already finished, when the quiet of early evening had settled into her small suburban home in Oregon and her thoughts were drifting toward nothing important at all, yet the sound stopped her completely, sharp but polite, not rushed, not careless, a knock that carried intention, and as she walked toward the door she felt a strange pressure in her chest, the kind that comes before memories return without warning, and when she opened the door her breath caught so suddenly it felt as if the air itself had changed, because standing there was Daniel, the man she had loved quietly and deeply years ago, the man who had left her life without explanation, and beside him stood a woman she recognized instantly from old photos, his mother, Margaret, holding a small basket with both hands and wearing a gentle smile that did not quite hide her curiosity, while Daniel stood stiff, taller than she remembered, his hair shorter, his face calmer but marked by something serious, and for a brief second none of them spoke, the silence stretching thin and fragile, and Emma's mind rushed backward through time to late-night talks, shared plans, unfinished promises, and unanswered messages that had once kept her awake, all of it crashing into her at once, and she wondered how a single knock could reopen years she had worked so hard to place behind her. Yet before she could stop herself she stepped aside and invited them in, her voice steady but distant, as if she were watching herself from far away, and as they entered her home she noticed how carefully Daniel looked around, like someone walking into a place filled with meaning, and Margaret thanked her kindly for welcoming them without notice, her tone respectful and warm, but Emma could barely focus on her words because Daniel's presence felt heavy, full of things unsaid, and as they moved into the living room Emma became aware of every small detail, the ticking clock, the fading light through the window, the way Daniel kept his hands folded as if holding himself together, and when he finally spoke her name it sounded softer than she expected, filled with hesitation and something close to regret, and in that moment Emma realized that this visit was not casual or accidental, that people did not bring their mothers to a door unless they were facing something serious, something meaningful, and as she offered them seats and sat across from them she felt her calm slipping, replaced by questions she had buried long ago, why he left, why he never explained, why he had chosen silence instead of honesty, and yet she said none of it, because part of her was afraid of the answers, afraid that hearing them would hurt just as much as not knowing had, and Margaret spoke again, praising Emma's home and thanking her for her kindness, then adding gently that Daniel had spoken of her often over the years, a statement that struck Emma like a quiet shock because it challenged the story she had told herself, the story where she had been forgotten, and Daniel finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his gaze steady but filled with something careful, and he admitted that coming here had taken courage, that it was not easy to face someone you once loved when you knew you had left without explanation, and Emma felt the old ache return, not sharp but deep, like a reminder that some connections do not fade with time, they simply wait, and though she said little, her silence spoke of boundaries she had built, of lessons learned through disappointment, and as the evening deepened and the first moments of conversation unfolded, Emma understood that this knock was not just a visit, it was the opening of a door she had long believed was closed forever, and whatever Daniel had come to say, whatever truths he carried, they would change something inside her, whether she allowed him back into her life or not, because some moments do not ask permission before they matter, they simply arrive and demand to be felt. They sat facing each other in the living room, the space suddenly feeling smaller as if the walls themselves were listening, and Emma noticed how carefully Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her posture calm but thoughtful, while Daniel kept his eyes low, studying the rug as though the patterns might offer the right words, and the silence between them was not empty but full, heavy with years that had passed without closure, and Emma broke it first by offering tea, more to give her hands something to do than out of kindness, and as she moved toward the kitchen she felt her thoughts racing, reminding herself to stay steady, to not let old emotions rise too quickly, yet when she returned and handed Daniel a cup their fingers almost touched and the familiar spark unsettled her, not with excitement but with recognition, and Margaret thanked her softly before speaking in a voice shaped by patience and care, explaining that this visit was important to her as well, that she had encouraged Daniel not to hide anymore, and Emma listened, unsure how to respond, because hearing that she had been part of their conversations all these years made her question everything she thought she knew, and Daniel finally looked up, his voice calm but firm as he admitted that leaving without explanation was his greatest regret, that he had convinced himself silence would protect everyone when it had only caused harm, and Emma felt a quiet wave of emotion rise. Not anger but disappointment mixed with relief, because hearing responsibility taken mattered more than excuses, and she told him plainly that she had waited for answers, that every unanswered message had felt like a door closing slowly, and Daniel did not interrupt, did not defend himself. He simply listened, nodding once as if each word confirmed something he already knew. And Margaret added that life had moved fast during those years, illness, responsibilities, fear, all pulling Daniel away from the man he wanted to be, but she made it clear she was not asking Emma for forgiveness. Only understanding, and Emma appreciated that honesty, because she had learned that real maturity did not demand quick healing, and as the conversation deepened the tension eased slightly, replaced by something fragile but real, and Daniel spoke about growth, about learning how absence could wound just as deeply as harsh words, and Emma realized that the man before her was not the boy she once knew. And that realization unsettled her more than anger ever could, because it meant the past could not simply be replayed, it had to be faced, and when Margaret mentioned that Daniel wanted to do things right this time, Emma felt her heart tighten, unsure what right meant after so much time, yet she did not stop the conversation, because despite her caution she felt a pull toward clarity, toward finally understanding why love had once slipped through her fingers, and as the clock ticked on and the evening grew quieter, Emma found herself asking careful questions, not about promises or feelings but about truth, and Daniel answered without hesitation, his words steady, stripped of drama, and for the first time she sensed sincerity without pressure, and though she guarded her heart, she allowed herself to sit in the moment, aware that this visit was not about reopening wounds but examining them honestly, and as Margaret watched them with quiet hope, Emma realized that part 2 of this unexpected evening was not about romance returning, but about two people standing in the same room again, no longer strangers, no longer pretending, finally speaking the words that time had delayed, and that alone felt like a turning point she could not ignore. They moved into the kitchen where the light was softer and the space felt less formal, and Emma focused on small tasks like filling the kettle and choosing cups because motion helped her think, while Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her with a quiet attention that made her aware of every breath she took, and Margaret sat at the table, giving them room without stepping away, her presence steady and calm, and as the water warmed, Daniel finally spoke again, not rushing his words, explaining that the year he left had been full of fear and pressure, that his father's illness had forced him into choices he was not ready to face, and instead of asking for help or explaining himself he had shut down, believing distance would make things easier, and Emma listened closely, noticing that he spoke without drama, without trying to soften the truth, and that honesty made his words feel real, and when he admitted that he had read her messages many times but lacked the courage to reply, Emma felt a sharp sting but kept her voice steady, telling him that silence had taught her painful lessons about self-worth, lessons she never wanted to learn that way, and Daniel nodded, accepting the weight of her words without argument, and Margaret added gently that watching her son struggle had been hard, that she had seen how regret followed him even when he tried to move forward, and Emma realized that this story was bigger than just the two of them, shaped by family, fear, and timing, and as the tea was poured and the cups were set down the conversation turned quieter but deeper, with Daniel explaining how time away had forced him to grow, to face his weaknesses, to understand that love required courage and communication, not escape, and Emma felt conflicted because part of her wanted to believe him while another part reminded her how carefully she had rebuilt her life, learning to stand on her own without waiting for someone else to choose her, and yet she could not deny that hearing his truth softened something inside her, not enough to erase the past but enough to change how it felt, and when Daniel looked at her directly and said he never stopped caring, that she had been the measure against which he judged all his mistakes, Emma felt the room grow very still, not with tension but with clarity, and she responded honestly, telling him she had changed too, that heartbreak had made her stronger, but also more careful, and that whatever existed between them now could not be rushed or assumed, and Daniel agreed immediately, saying he did not come for promises or answers, only to speak the truth and let her decide what came next, and that respect eased her more than any declaration could. And as the evening stretched on they spoke about work, about how life had shaped them differently, about missed chances and unexpected growth, and Emma noticed that conversation flowed easily, not like before but in a more grounded way, and she realized that attraction was still there but tempered by maturity, no longer careless or idealized, and Margaret eventually stood and excused herself to step outside for air, sensing the moment belonged to them, and Emma and Daniel were left facing each other across the small kitchen table, older, more honest, carrying both memory and possibility, and Emma understood that part 3 of this night was not about deciding the future, but about seeing each other clearly for the first time, without fantasy, without blame, and that realization felt heavy but hopeful, like standing on the edge of something unknown yet meaningful, knowing that whatever happened next would be chosen with open eyes. The house felt quieter after Margaret stepped outside, not empty but focused, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away, and Emma stood near the window for a moment, gathering her thoughts while Daniel remained by the table, giving her space without distance, and when she turned back to him she spoke calmly, saying that hearing the truth mattered but time had taught her caution, that trust once broken did not return simply because regret was sincere, and Daniel listened carefully, nodding, telling her he understood and that he was not there to push or convince, only to be present and honest, and that choice alone softened something inside her because it showed respect she once wished for, and as they talked the pace of the night felt steady but meaningful, each sentence carrying weight without drama, and Emma admitted that for a long time she believed closure meant forgetting, but now she saw it could also mean understanding without reopening old pain, and Daniel replied that he had spent years believing distance could erase mistakes when in truth it only delayed responsibility, and they shared a quiet understanding in that moment, not romantic in a dramatic way but deep and human, shaped by experience, and Emma reflected on how life had changed her, how independence had given her strength but also loneliness she rarely admitted. And Daniel spoke about learning patience, about rebuilding himself slowly, about no longer running when life became heavy, and their words met somewhere in the middle, not as promises but as possibilities. And when Margaret returned, smiling gently and asking if everything was all right, Emma surprised herself by smiling back, not because everything was resolved but because something important had settled into place. And they moved back into the living room where the night felt calmer, the earlier tension replaced by quiet clarity, and Daniel stood to leave, thanking Emma for opening her door and her time, saying that whatever she chose next he respected it, and Emma walked them to the door, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity, and just before stepping outside Daniel paused and looked at her, not with expectation but with hope carefully held, and Emma realized that hope did not always demand immediate answers. Sometimes it simply waited, and as they said goodbye, polite but warm, Emma closed the door and leaned against it, her heart steady, not racing, but aware that something had shifted, not backward into the past but forward into understanding, and she knew that whatever came next would be chosen slowly, thoughtfully, without fear, and as she turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, the night no longer felt heavy but open, and Emma understood that the shock of his arrival had not undone her life. It had clarified it, reminding her that growth did not mean closing doors forever, only choosing when and how to open them again, and with that quiet certainty she stepped into the next day ready for whatever chapter might follow, knowing that this story did not end with a knock, but with a choice made in calm, strength, and honesty.